Horse race, not the only poll making headlines. Fox News out with new data on social media and terrorism, showing voters are split over the fact that the Obama administration does not screen social media when doing immigration background checks. From the poll, 63% say not reviewing social media is, quote, just crazy, while 32% say it makes sense. With more on this issue of privacy, cybersecurity, and policy, let's bring in Peter Beshar. He is Executive Vice President and General Counsel of the Marsh and McLennan companies. Peter, good to see you.
Yeah, delighted
Thanks so much for joining us. It is a little bizarre that we would not be looking at social media when vetting people coming into this country, don't you think?
I think given the attacks in California, it's perfectly understandable that people are concerned. And certainly if there are social media posts that are public, Maria, that should be fair game. I think private email is something really quite different.
Yeah, what about that? Tell me about the private email part of the story.
Well, it's really part of the dynamic between privacy and security.
Right.
And that dynamic changes quite profoundly based on the mood of the country. And clearly in the wake of terrorist attacks, whether in Europe or in the United States, security concerns have to rise and privacy has to abate somewhat under that dynamic. In times of peace and prosperity, you can have an inversion of that. But right now it's a different dynamic in the country.
I could totally see that privacy takes a back seat to our fears over national security. But what about the responsibility that technology companies have in order to, call it out, in order to give government a back door into overseeing data so that they can better track terrorists?
I think, Maria, one of the astonishing things is the evolution in the nature of the cyber threat. There was a report in the Wall Street Journal yesterday saying that Iranians are allegedly trying to breach into a dam in New York State. And so that critical infrastructure is a legitimate component now of the cyber threat. The escalation has just been dramatic. So even several years ago, the main news was about the theft of credit cards, the big retailers that were in the news, tens of millions of credit cards. But that threat is not that substantial because banks could cut off the credit cards and consumers weren't responsible for the personal fraud.
Right.
Then it stepped up to Social Security numbers, where they say, well, I want something that really is more lasting. You only get one Social Security number.
Right.
And so that was really the health care fraud that you saw. And once you have an individual's Social Security number, you can commit tax fraud.
Right.
You can commit false health care claims. And so really the world that we're now dealing with is critical infrastructure.
And this is what Tim Cook was saying, the CEO of Apple, the other night on 60 Minutes, basically saying, look, if you allow government to have this back door into overseeing people's data, then there's a back door, period. So that's a back door for the good guys as well as the bad guys, which is why he says we have to push back and not allow government to just have, open field in communication.
Yeah, and that was very interesting because that's not the last we've heard of this issue. Tim Cook stood his ground and said he was going to stand his ground, but at the same time, it's a different world we live in today. If we know there are terrorists coming to this country to attack us, and if there are internet companies or social media companies or any company that may potentially have an advanced knowledge of that, I think there has to be some way for the government to get notified of that. We all need our rights, but we also need to protect ourselves.
I know. It's a slippery slope, though.
Hillary Clinton, I have a question for you. Hillary Clinton said in the debate on Saturday night that she wants a Manhattan Project for encryption. Do you have any clue what she meant by that? Because I'm still trying to figure it out.
Yeah, there's a lot of lousy news on the cyber environment, Morgan, but there's also some good news. That last week was actually one of the biggest developments in the cyber world with the passage of the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. So for the first time now, business and the government is really being encouraged to actively share cyber threat indicators back and forth. So this is the type of thing that has to happen between industry on the one hand and government on the other. Whether the issue is encryption or the sharing of spear phishing campaigns or the latest form of attack, there just has to be a good faith exchange between the industry and the government fundamentally.
What does that mean in terms of people's privacy and their data?
I think really it's quite a good development, Maria, fundamentally, because if the most common form of attack right now in cybersecurity is a so-called spear phishing campaign.
Right.
They go on your LinkedIn account and they find out the names of your connections, when your birthday is, what college you went to, and then they send you a very tailored email that essentially lures you in and says, Maria, happy birthday, here are your best wishes, here's a shot of our reunion from college.
Just so that you click on it.
And you, just by clicking on that, you install malware into your system or malicious software. And what that software does is track every single one of the keystrokes that you then make.
Wow.
And so when you enter in the morning, they know your password. Once they know your login credentials, they can then go like a spider through the rest of your network.
Wow, that is scary stuff because you just don't know when it ends.
Well, and I have a question for you as well. I mean, I think sort of the way I was speaking to a friend who works in cyber about this yesterday, and I think the bottom line is, in terms of our security, is that the terrorists are using encrypted software in order to communicate. So if that's sort of the bottom line, don't the social media companies have responsibility here, and what should they be doing to work with government to counter it?
Sure. One interesting way to look at that, Morgan, is the dynamic in Europe. So the historical divide between the two continents has been the U.S. historically has been very focused on security over privacy. And Europe has been just the opposite. Really, privacy is perceived as a core human right. And so that has been in the right to be forgotten decisions that the tech companies don't like in Europe. But now in the wake of the terrorist attacks, both the Charlie Hebdo attacks in January and then the horrific attacks of last month, that dynamic has to change. That privacy has to subside in some measure as people are legitimately concerned about their safety.
You would think so. You would think so. Peter, great insights today. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Maria.
We appreciate it. Peter Beshar there from Marsh & McLennan.